Hello there, I'm Miranda Gretton, and this is Take a Moment with NCHC, the show where we talk to you and your colleagues about experiences that affect you. Listen on your drive between patients or in your downtime, whenever you get the chance to take a moment.
In this episode, I speak to research nurse Donna Clements about self-compassion, what it is, the importance of practicing it, and how it can help our well-being.
So my name's Donna. I'm a community clinical research nurse. So my day job is clinical research within the community settings, conducting any sort of research, falls, hip fracture rehab, so lots of different things.
So how did you get involved in self-compassion then?
Okay, so self-compassion for me was a hugely valuable tool at a really, really difficult time in my life. So I was working as a nurse elsewhere, going through a particularly traumatic situation, and a friend of mine who was training to be a clinical psychologist helped me out. We had a chat one day and I said, I've just had some feedback and I've got low self-esteem. And she just laughed and went, Donna, you are the last person who I would ever say has low self-esteem. She says, I think what you've got is low self-compassion. She says, you do a brilliant job. You know you do a brilliant job. You're great with your patients. You really deliver on the work that you do. You don't have low self-esteem, but what you struggle to do is realise how good you are and what you do and what you manage to do day to day in your life. So that was my very first experience with self-compassion. And yeah, that's how I came to discover it.
I find that so fascinating because I think so many people use the term self-esteem. We always think, oh, I've got low self-esteem. I don't know how to shout about my accomplishments or even just to say that I'm a nice person. People struggle with sort of patting ourselves on the back, don't we? So actually to hear that it's not necessarily about self-esteem, it's about being kinder to yourself. So is that what self-compassion is then?
Yes, absolutely. In a nutshell, self-compassion is it's introduced by Kristen Neff and Chris Germer as mindful self-compassion because it really is being present in that moment and seeing your own suffering and responding to yourself in a compassionate way. So you say to your friend, you know what, this is a tough situation. Anyone would struggle here. That's okay. You're doing brilliantly. Well, look in a mirror and say it to yourself because we don't. What we do is we look in a mirror and we listen to the voice that says, you're not really doing this very well, are you? You got that wrong the other day. You said this wrong. You caused that argument. And you listen to your self-critical voice rather than your self-compassionate voice.
What are the tools? I mean, how do we do that? It's very easy to say. It's very easy to say, be kind to yourself and tell yourself those things. But I struggle with it. How can you do that? How do you approach that with yourself?
Okay, so there are some short exercises that Kristen Neff has actually developed that you can do. And on her website, there are some really nice little podcasts and little exercises that you can do depending on the length of time that you've got available. But self-compassion is really, it's a new way of talking to yourself. And it's a new way of thinking. So this morning, I was trying to think, how can I describe it? And I had a conversation with my dad the other day, and we were just laughing and joking about using different hands to do things. So I was putting up some new coat hooks, so he came over and gave me a hand. And I got the screwdriver. Now I'm right-handed, so ordinarily I would do the screws with the screwdriver in my right hand. But I said, I'm challenging myself to doing things with my left hand. And so I'm going to train my left hand to be as strong as my right hand. And I thought that's what self-compassion is. It's training your self-compassionate voice to be louder than your self-critical voice. It doesn't happen overnight. So when you first go to pick up the screwdriver, if you're right-handed, you'll instantly go to pick it up with your right hand, which means if you're having a tough day, you'll instantly go to, oh, what a tough day, I'm rubbish at my job. So change what you're doing. So go to the screwdriver, pick it up with your left hand. So if you're having a tough day, go, right, just press pause, turn on my self-compassionate voice and saying, do you know, I am having a tough day. And I'm only human, so I know I'm going to experience tough days. And actually, that situation I was just in, that wasn't my fault. I did my best in that situation. And you know what? That was okay, because that's what I did. And so it's using that self-compassionate voice more frequently and more frequently, so that one day you'll go to pick up the screwdriver and you'll instantly pick it up with your left hand rather than your right hand. So you'll find as the days go on and you practice self-compassion, you end up going, oh yeah, it was a tough day, but you know what? I did all right. And you'll do that instantly. You won't even have to press pause before your self-critical voice comes in, because your self-compassionate voice will already be there.
Practice really is the thing, isn't it? We would practice if we were trying to learn the guitar. So why not practice that we're trying to learn? This is essentially a skill, isn't it? If we've had years of being self-critical, this is a skill to change our way of thinking. So it's practice like it is with anything else. How do you think outside influence has shaped us as people then? Do you think that there's a lot to do with how we were brought up, or how critical perhaps our parents were with us as children? Do you think there's a history sort of there that impacts how quickly we're able to turn that inner voice on?
Yeah, I think it's a really complex situation. So I'm developing self-compassion as a PhD project, to actually deliver to community nurses. So I've had to dig deep into lots of the literature, lots of the evidence and the research that's gone beforehand. And an interesting point that Kristin Neff makes is that going back in the 80s in America, there was actually a state-delivered education program for self-esteem for children in school. So it was teaching children how to be brilliant, how to be the best, how to be the top of your game. What it didn't teach them was, what do you do when it goes wrong? What do you do when you fail? And that's where self-compassion comes in. It's great saying, I want to work really hard for this job. I want to go on this training course so I can do these extra things. Or I really want to make sure that when I go into this patient, X, Y, and Z happens so that they get the best outcome. But you can't always do that. There's always going to be factors outside of your control. So it's then saying, well, how do I now handle myself? How do I be kind to myself when it didn't go the way I thought it would? So that's the difference between self-esteem and self-compassion. Self-esteem allows you to have all the tools in the box to win the race, but if you don't win it, it doesn't tell you how to cope with that. Self-compassion allows you to cope with your failures as well as your successes. Schools teach us to achieve. Again, it's a complex situation as to why those achievements are pressed upon us. And I think generally as a society, we always want more, we always want better. And that looks different for each and every individual, but everyone, I think, wants better. And I think there is this overarching expectation now of happiness. And I think everybody's trying to achieve this happiness. It's okay, we can't be excellent at everything, but let's be happy. Well, happiness is a harder thing than you realize to try and achieve. And the human being is there to be. It is not a human doing or a human achieving, it's a human being. Self-compassion helps you be in the moment. It helps you be content, be accepting, and helps you really realize what you are and what you're doing in that moment and how you're being in that moment.
And like you say, that's different for every person because that measure of happiness for some people could be overcoming a challenging day. Having that reflection on a difficult day and saying, oh, it was very hard, but I overcame it and I did this and I learned this from it. So turning that failure into a success could equal the happiness that everybody is so striving for. But in terms of our staff, I mean, this is huge. Self-esteem versus self-compassion to me is something that we need to be shouting from the rooftops to our staff, because to have a hard day in this profession, fair to say it's going to be a lot worse than some professions. What's your experience of nurses and therapists and all of our other staff and how they deal with their hard days?
As healthcare professionals, we are taught to reflect on our days. Certainly as a nurse, when we go through our revalidation, we have to go through reflection. That's part of our learning. The ways in which we reflect tend to be taught to us to be self-critical. The questions are things like, what did you do? How could you have done it differently? What would you do better next time? So it's very focused on you as the individual. And that, I think, is where, as healthcare professionals, we do turn up the self-critical voice, because the people or the output of our job is people, it's human beings. There's an emotional connection there. And particularly when you're working in the community and you're going into people's homes, you're seeing them as the people in which they exist in that moment. You're seeing the photos of their family. You're seeing the difficulties that they're trying to live with. So it's an incredibly precious moment for that person to open their front door and let you into the most private area of their life. So it's charged with emotion anyway. And I think what COVID has also done is increase the complexity of care that people are receiving in their own homes. And that's to try and keep them out of hospital. It's to try and do the best we can whilst they're in their own homes. So our community nurses, our community staff, colleagues have actually seen pressure increase, not only in the sheer numbers and the volume of work that's out there now, but also the complexity of work. And I think healthcare workers, we always strive to do our best. We always want to give the best care that we can to the people we're treating, as we would do to our relatives. And when you're trying to work within those standards all of the time, and you know you're short of the mark quite a lot of the time, it's a really difficult thing to handle. And it's really hard at the end of the day to say, I did a good job, when you know actually there's parts of the job you didn't do because you couldn't. It simply wasn't possible. So how can you give yourself a pat on the back when you feel like you haven't really done your job properly? And that's where I think self-esteem teaches you that you failed. You set your goal and you failed, and doesn't tell you how to deal with that. And self-compassion comes in and says, okay, that was the goal first thing this morning. However, throughout the day, this happened, that happened, and that happened. And what you managed to achieve was this, this, and this. Well done. You did the best that you can. And there's certain organisational things, environmental things that were just completely beyond your control. So accept that, go home and have a lovely evening with whatever is at home for you.
That's resonated with me because I really struggle with situations that are out of my control, that make something go wrong that I'm responsible for. Even though people say, oh, can say, oh, well, that wasn't your fault, I will still absolutely beat myself up about it. So those situations that are out of our control, how can we accept that? It's very easy to say, isn't it? To say, go home, accept that those things were out of your control and that it happened. You did a good job. How do we do that? How can our community staff go home at the end of the day and say, you know what, that happened. I'm just going to go to bed and it'll all be fine.
It's a really tough one, and certainly self-compassion, when you practice it day on, day out, then it can help you get there. I had a really sobering moment. So throughout COVID, I was redeployed from my research role to Caroline House. So neurological nursing is my background, so I went and supported them. And I had a real tough time personally in coping with the situation, because I just felt like I wasn't doing enough. And I felt that I could do more, I was able to do more, and I wanted to do more. So I took the opportunity to have a session with the psychologist. So Anastasia was fantastic. And she talked me through the situation, how I was feeling. And it was me wanting to say, I can do more, I should be doing more, I want to be doing more. As you say, I want to be in control of the situation. And Anastasia, it was a short, sharp comment, but really resonated and hit me a little bit where it hurts, but it was what I needed to hear. I can't go into the total complexities because it's a psychological theory. But she said to me, remember, on the flip side of sort of taking the blame in situations, the flip side of that coin is the God complex, where you say, I'm in control of this situation, therefore I'm responsible for everything that happens. That's the God complex. Now, when she said that to me, and still when I say it, my stomach turns over. I think, no, I don't have a God complex. That's the last thing I have. But when you flip that coin over and say, it's my fault that this day didn't go right, are you actually saying, I was completely in control and therefore it should have gone right? And I think lots of people are uncomfortable with the God complex. We often assign that to people like Donald Trump, and it's an uncomfortable feeling. So that helped me really think that certain situations I've been in the past wasn't my fault. I shouldn't be taking the blame for that. It really wasn't my fault. That person's actions or the situation that day or the organization of that particular situation was way beyond my control. It wasn't my fault. That happened how it happened. You can only be responsible for your own actions. And yeah, we can criticize ourselves for our own actions, but we must make sure we do that in a kind way, as we would do to our best friend, so that we can say, okay, this day didn't go as planned, but you did the best that you could. It's not your fault. You are not to blame. You did what you could and what was the best thing to do in that situation. It's hard,
It
but if
is
you can
hard,
have,
isn't it? It's not just being kind, it's being fair.
yeah,
Because if, as soon as you're fair, you can say, well, if I'm being really honest and open with myself, I can see that it wasn't all my fault, and of course I'm not to blame, but it's just having that fairness with yourself, especially in this profession. I think our staff will feel that perhaps a lot more acutely. Our staff will think, I was the one who went into that house, or I was the one who treated that bay in the inpatient unit that day. I was responsible for administering that medicine. It does, you can totally see, can't you, how it would come down to a God complex. Well, of course it's my fault because I administered the thing. So what we're saying is to take into account a lot more factors in your day and to take it a day at a time.
yes, yeah, and even a situation at a time. Because again, a 24-hour period doesn't run the same from hour to hour. So take it situation by situation. And a lot of us know we've got a little bit of an idea of what's going to happen throughout our day. If we're working on a ward, we're familiar with the routine of the ward. If we're in the community, we've got a routine and we may well know some of the people we're going to see. And there might be some of those parts to our day that we dread the thinking about it, and we think, oh, I've got this coming up later. This doesn't sit well with me. Or you might be thinking, oh, I've got to go back to that. And yeah, I didn't do my best last time, or I got it wrong. Or as you say, if I gave that medication incorrectly or something. And we do have professional accountability. So that is part of our code of practice as healthcare professionals. So we don't take that away at all. That still is there. But it's about saying, how should I respond kindly towards myself in that situation? And there are 3 steps to self-compassion. The first one is to really recognize that what you're going through is hurting you. It is a moment of suffering. And then the second part is realizing that suffering is just part of life. It's part of being a human. Nobody goes throughout life without suffering. And then the third element is to be kind to yourself and to talk to yourself in a kind way. And I think that's really where our colleagues across the trust can really start to use self-compassion, is that we are healthcare professionals and we are there to do our best with a human being, but we are also people. We are also human beings. We're not robots. We do get things wrong from time to time. That might be because we're tired. It might be because the last person we interacted with was a bit rude to us. And we know that that can reduce confidence by around 60%. So that's quite a normal and natural thing to happen. And there's going to be lots of other things like that along the way that's going to make you perhaps not quite present in the particular task you're doing at that moment in time. And that might be when you make a little mistake. But think about what happened leading up to that particular situation where you made that little mistake. Was it because someone was rude to you? Was it because the traffic was holding you up, so you got to the patient's house later than you thought you were going to? Was it because you were on the ward and you had yet another admission to deal with and you felt you hadn't really finished with the first one properly? So is it mounting pressure? Is it another colleague has phoned in sick? There's always going to be factors as to why you make those little mistakes. And that all has to be taken into account. Human factors is huge when it comes to making mistakes. In healthcare, yes, it can have really serious consequences, but we are healthcare humans delivering healthcare. We're not robots.
You talked about reflection as part of being a healthcare professional. Does it always have to be with hindsight that you look back on these moments and apply the practice of self-compassion? Or is there any way you can plan ahead and think, well, today is going to be a particularly difficult day. It's going to be a similar day to one I had last week where I did apply it post situation. What can you do almost proactively in terms of self-compassion?
Yeah, I think self-compassion is, once you've got it, it's with you all the time. And that's the great thing about it, is that, you haven't got to go on an app, you haven't got to make an appointment to speak to somebody. It's you, and it's with you 24/7 whenever you want it. So you can use it if you're planning your day and you're thinking, oh crikey, yes, I've got that situation coming up. Then recognize how the thought of that situation is making you feel, and talk to yourself self-compassionately in the lead up to that situation. Use it as part of your preparation. I mean, I've got a dog, so I walk around the fields first thing in the morning, and I'm doing that. I kind of roughly know what's coming up in my day. I know particular things that I would rather leave so they didn't get done during the day, because they don't sit comfortably with me. And I kind of think, okay, how am I going to prepare for that? What's going to make it easier for me to do it? What can't I change that I'm just going to have to accept? And try to really shrink those bits into just a tiny part of it, because they are tiny. We all do that. We blow things out of proportion. If it's perhaps having a conversation with somebody else, how many times do we preempt that conversation in our heads and almost have that full-blown conversation about what they're going to say, how I'm going to respond back to it, how they're going to react to what I've just said, what am I then going to do? And we have those conversations before they happen in our own heads. We are never going to be able to know what kind of day that person's having, how they're going to respond to us when we have that conversation with them. So what we can do is we can say, okay, so it might not be the easiest conversation in the world because we've got some tricky things to discuss. It might be a difficult diagnosis. It might be a change in someone's treatment plan. It might be a conversation with a colleague that you need to have. But we can recognize how we're feeling, and if we've got those butterflies in our stomach, or we're feeling a bit anxious, so maybe our heart rate's beating a little bit faster, we can just stop and recognize those physical feelings and say, okay, where's that coming from? Coming from the fact that I'm anxious or stressed about this situation, and break it down into pieces. What's the biggest thing, the most obvious thing that's making me anxious? And it could be not knowing what they're going to say or how they're going to deal with it. You're never going to know that. That's the God complex. You're never going to be able to change that. So try and shrink that down and think, well, okay, if they don't react all that well, how can I help them with that? Rather than thinking, how am I going to react to that? Think about how I will respond to that. A response is a thought about way, it's a thought about, it's words that you have with somebody. A reaction comes from your gut, it's an emotion. So your reaction is, oh my goodness. A response is, okay, that sounds tricky for you. And those two reactions, responses that you can give to somebody may well very much change how that conversation will then go. And I think we often don't think too much about reactions and responses, and how they can be different and how they can change the situation, and being self-compassionate to yourself in that situation. So you might be very well aware during that situation where you go, okay, I've just reacted there instead of responding, because you'll notice it when you're mindful and in the situation. And you can say, okay, that's all right. I've noticed it. It's out there now. It's in the past. I can't change it. So just say that to yourself. It's happened. And then maybe just take a breath. Just take some time, take some space during that conversation to maybe give them control of what's going on. And so using techniques like that can help you preempt what is coming up through your day and how you might be able to handle it. And just remember that, the best laid plans usually fall by the wayside.
Something for me that I sort of can't ever imagine is getting to that point where I naturally do all of these things. I'm naturally self-compassionate with myself. So yeah, I think it would take time, but it's great to have those things that you can put in place to help. We talked a lot about our healthcare colleagues, but obviously we've got a lot of support services colleagues who are not in patient-facing roles. This is obviously going to have a huge impact on those staff as well, isn't it? But in a slightly different way, I'd imagine.
Yeah, definitely. And sort of part of preparing all of this for my PhD is sort of looking at the overall benefits and what are my working theories as to how this would help. And that's certainly a huge benefit. So healthcare staff interact with the support staff all the time. If you are, you are a community nurse, you're out there on the road, this has gone wrong, that's gone wrong, suddenly your laptop goes wrong. So you pick up the phone to IT, your conversation isn't that great because you just want it sorted out and you want it sorted out now. How does that then leave, our support guys leaving? How does that leave them feeling, once this has happened? So there is always a ripple effect to however anyone's day is going. And we talk about, the straw that broke the camel's back because it's literally the last thing. I talk about stress as building blocks. So you've got individual building blocks of stress, but they don't line themselves up nicely in a brick wall. They line themselves up in a tower, one on top of the other, and it becomes a very, very tall tower. And it can be just that one thing that just makes that tower topple over. And so it's so important that we do recognise that everyone's got a tower of stress, and it might be that one thing, that might be your one reaction towards one of your colleagues that topples their tower. So be responsible for your own tower. Remove the sections of stress that you perhaps don't need that day or for that moment in time. But simply recognizing those little sections of stress in your tower of stress is a good place to start, because it really does make you think about, what do I need to carry in my tower of stress and what can I leave behind right now? And that goes for everyone, whether you're a healthcare professional, whether you're support staff, it doesn't matter who. And I think just, remember that everyone's a human being. Everyone is. And we all react, respond. We've got different personalities. We respond to different things in different ways. And support staff, in fact, when I very first started looking at self-compassion, I was working a lot with GP practices. And it was the practice manager who was like, oh my goodness, I need self-compassion, because they're trying to juggle so many different balls, just like our operational managers within our trust, just as, our partner colleagues, like our G4S cleaning supervisors, all of our colleagues who actually keep the whole trust functioning so that we can deliver care to patients. We all have our little towers of stress, and we all just need to give each other that little time and space to respect and respond to that. And I think self-compassion it's something that is simple in principle, just as lifting a 1 kilogram weight every day is simple in principle. But if you try and do that day in, day out, all of the time, it's really tricky. But soon enough, you'll pick up that weight and carry it without any issue. So yeah, it's something which can be practiced, can be learned, and can be embedded into everyday life.
Why do you think people struggle so much with something like this? Like changing your life and thinking, oh, I'm overweight, I need to lose weight, I'm going to implement steps. Oh, look, I've lost weight. It's like that kind of journey seems to happen quite a lot for a lot of people. Why is it more difficult with our mental health? Why do we find it more difficult to pick up those tools, implement them, and see a change over time?
That's a tricky one, and that goes into sort of another area which is quite in depth about change philosophy and the psychology behind that. My theory on it, we're born and raised into whatever culture, beliefs, values, morals that we learn throughout our lives and pick up along the way. We intrinsically bring that into part of our identity. That is who we are. But we can change behaviours within those identities that we hang on to. And behaviours can change. You can look at life in a different way. And mental health has been something which has come to the fore recently, And I think throughout COVID has been so important that we do look at our mental health and we do say, well, let's start applying the same philosophy. So if we do need to eat less and move more in order to improve our physical health, what do we need to improve our mental health? So maybe in our mental health, we need to say to take in less, and be more focused in what we do, perhaps, if we can kind of use that same principle. But our mental health, I think, because we see that so much more ingrained within our identity, that's why it's a harder thing to think about changing. And as you say, well, if that's me, that's my nature to react in that certain way to that situation. You feel like you are letting go a piece of you if you feel you have to change that. But if you take that a step further and say, well, that's how I react and that's the situation, that's how the situation always pans out, and I don't like that, it's harmful, why not think about a little tweak that you can make so that you can behave differently in that situation? It doesn't change your identity or who you are. It doesn't change your underlying values or principles. You're just taking the path around the situation so that the outcome is helpful to you rather than harmful.
Can you practice self-compassion just by yourself in isolation, or do you think it's more powerful if you talk about it?
So it's great for you to practice on your own once you've got to grips with it, but getting to grips with it is the hard bit. It's easier to do in a group, and that's really where it has been developed. It's been developed in group sessions. And I think what that does, so the key principles of self-compassion is recognizing your suffering, knowing that that's part of humanity, and then being kind in your conversation with yourself. But when you are sitting on your own, it's very easy to think, I'm the only one going through this. Why is no one else stressing about climate change? Why is no one else worried that there's a set of temporary traffic lights now that's been put up on my way to that patient and I know it's going to make me late? Why does no one else worry about this? So when you start off and you're in a group and people feel safe and secure that they can trust one another when they say, it really stresses me out when I have to go a different way to that place because of temporary traffic lights. And someone says, I know what you mean. It really stresses me out too. And you share those feelings, and that's being human. That part of the human complex is looking for similarities between your peers, between the people who you exist with. That's how we form communities. So when you're learning self-compassion, learning it in a group and actually experiencing it in a group can really enforce the underlying principle of humanity. We all experience the same things. We experience them in different ways. They make us feel differently sometimes, but we all experience them. And then once you've got it and you can actually have a compassionate conversation with yourself, that's when that is used best on a one-to-one basis with yourself, one-to-one. People who are more self-compassionate practice more self-care. So self-care is different from self-compassion. Self-care is making time for yourself. So instead of saying, oh, well, I'll just sling a microwave meal in, I'll take some time to make myself a nice meal. It's saying, oh, I will treat myself to that massage. That's self-care. But you have to have self-compassion to recognize that you need self-care to start off with. And then once you say, hang on, I'm giving myself permission to self-care, this is really good. I'm going to suggest it to some friends. And you start to talk about how you went through this process. And the evidence shows that you do become more compassionate. And that's why it's such an important thing for healthcare staff who are experiencing burnout. They're experiencing compassion fatigue because they, day in, day out, are dealing with really difficult circumstances and having to be compassionate towards people all the time. But when do they recharge their own compassion battery? So how do we make sure that people can recharge their compassion? And self-compassion is a really good way to do that. The motto in my head, I used to do a lot of traveling, so I was on planes all the time. And what stuck in my head was, put on your own oxygen mask before assisting others. because we're useless. Once we have run out of compassion for ourselves, we have no compassion for anybody else. So put on your compassion mask before providing compassion to others.
Self-care doesn't have to be the massage or the spa day, or that people say. It can just sometimes be sitting in a room in absolute silence, staring at a wall.
Yes.
Taking that time out to not think about your day and the patients that you saw and maybe what went wrong, taking time away from those thoughts to think about something really simple.
Completely. And not judging yourself for doing it. A phrase, I think I've probably borrowed this from somewhere, so can't credit because I don't know where from, but the phrase, what you think about me says more about you than it does about me, is so important, because you can only judge yourself. You can't judge anyone else because you know nothing about them. You don't know what makes them tick. You don't know what they do when they get home from work at the end of the day. You don't know how they stress about their income. You don't know how they feed themselves. You can't judge them. You can only judge yourself. And if you're judging yourself against an unrealistic set of expectations, that's a really harmful thing to do. And that's very self-compassionate.
Yeah.
So if you judge yourself in a kind way and you say to yourself, do you know, it's been a really tough day. I'm going to take half an hour out to watch EastEnders. That's okay. And don't judge yourself for it. Women are definitely, and again, proven to be less self-compassionate. They tend to want people to like them more. And that's a complex situation. And I think we need to understand that when it comes to the provision of healthcare, because healthcare is generally still, because of history, delivered by females. So is it any surprise that we now find ourselves in a situation where we're having to think about things like self-compassion in order to support our colleagues to continue to deliver high quality and safe healthcare?
What support is, like physical support, is there anything that the trust offers in terms of resources for self-compassion?
So this trust is very good at the support that they provide through health and wellbeing, and that's sort of one of my stumbling blocks really when it comes to trying to fit this in, because they do provide so much. It's really good on all our intranet pages. And our professional bodies provide a lot as well. So the Royal College of Nursing, Nursing and Midwifery Council, they provide a lot of support. I think the difficulty is knowing what support do I need, when do I need it, and in a busy life, when do I access it? So it can be really tricky. And I think particularly if you feel like your stress and your mental health is affected by work, you feel like you want to address it in work time. But then if you are able to take some time out of your clinical day, you're then worrying about the patients you're not seeing because you've taken that time out. So you end up in this endless spiral of guilt of what I should be doing rather than what's important for me to be doing right now. And we've all got lives outside of work. So to then try and say, well, I need to now find some time in my life outside of work to try and fit in some sessions, some health and well-being, can be a really tricky thing. I think the difference with self-compassion is that it is something you can learn. It's something you can pick up and tune into whenever you want to. It's not a therapy as such, so you don't need to have a specific diagnosis or be experiencing specific symptoms in order to use it. It's more of a philosophy, if you like. I guess it's an approach to life, saying I'm going to be kinder to myself so that I'm kinder to other people. And I think that underpins humanity, really.
Thank you for listening to Take a Moment with NCHC. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please visit the podcast intranet page to leave a comment and for details of our other episodes. You can also follow NCHC on all social media channels.